At the Senate of the Republic of Italy, speakers of the G20 parliaments converged for its 7th summit to discuss on rebooting economic growth in terms of social and environmental sustainability. One of its keynote speakers and president of the African Development Bank, Dr. Adesina, made a strong case for Africa as a voice of the continent. He highlighted areas of inequity, including what he calls vaccine, climate change, and energy transition injustice. Dr. Adesina believes it's only fair not to continue treating Africa as a charity case, but rather with dignity and respect, while highlighting areas of intervention by the continent's development bank. Dr. Adesina's presentation at the G20 Parliamentary Speakers Summit is our focus on this episode of Special Report. Thanks for joining us. I'm Jeffrey Uzongo.
The opening ceremony of an international forum that brings together the world's biggest economies.
Buongiorno a tutti.
Good morning, everyone.
It's the 2020 edition of the G20 Parliamentary Speakers Summit, known as P20. Delegates converge on Palazzo Madama, seat of the Italian Senate in Italy's capital, Rome, for the two-day deliberations, with the theme Rebooting Economic Growth in Terms of Social and Environmental Sustainability.
It is a pleasure and an honor for me to welcome you in Italy's Senate for the opening session of the Parliamentary Speaker Summit of the G20 countries.
Each year, the Presidency invites guest countries to participate in the deliberations. Several international organizations also participate, giving the forum a broader representation.
Un ruolo guida, quello che l'Unione Europea ha assunto nella transizione ecologica.
The President of the Italian Senate and host, Her Excellency Ms. Maria Elisabetta Alberti Casellati, chairs the 7th edition, which came at an important moment, midway between the recent United Nations Food Systems Summit and the upcoming G20 meeting in Italy.
The priorities of the Italian presidency of the G20 have been interpreted through 3 words: people, planet, and prosperity, the famous 3 Ps. And to those 3 Ps, we decided to add a 4th P, the letter with which the word parliaments begins, as a way of underscoring the importance of our parliamentary activities, the importance of the dialogue between lawmakers, and we wish to focus on the added value which is offered by the contribution of parliaments to the G20 process. G20 countries represent 60% of the world's population, 80% of global wealth, and 75% of international trade. Relaunch and revitalize the growth of our countries has to go hand in hand with our ability to define a new development model, one that can focus on the human person, so as to fully take advantage of the opportunity offered by innovation and progress, such as the beneficial effects of the digital revolution, a more harmonious relationship with the environment, the resources which stem from knowledge and culture. An integrated vision of the Italian G20's 3 priorities, namely people, planet, and prosperity, is a vision we want to have during our summit as well, with the contribution of all of the colleagues, all of the speakers and presidents, with the experts and representatives of civil society, of the scientific sector, and all of the members of international organizations. Dear colleagues, as you know, in previous weeks, a joint statement has been considered. It has been improved and enriched by the contribution of several national delegations, whom I wish to thank. This will be the trace we will leave following this activity of ours. Only by strengthening and supporting the tools of multilateralism on all levels, and through parliamentary cooperation, will we be able to deal with the responsibility and farsightedness, all of the huge challenges we face. This is a major test for mankind. We have to have a global perspective in mind as we work towards a shared future which can be better for ourselves and especially for the future generations. And in this regard, as President of the Italian Senate, allow me to express my concern for the dramatic crisis in Afghanistan. The Afghan people had benefited from 20 years of social progress and pacification, which is now once again surrounded by instability and chaos. The promises of moderation, unfortunately, have not been fulfilled, as we can see from the events taking place. And I wish to think of the Afghan female members of parliament who have worked for the progress of their country for so many years. For all women, there are dark times ahead. We cannot and must not abandon them.
One of the keynote speakers at the conference of the world leading economies, which accounts for more than 80% of the world gross domestic product, 75% of global trade, and 60% of global population, is a world-renowned economist who had served as Nigeria's Minister of Agriculture and the current president of the African Development Bank, Dr. Kinwumi Adesina.
I'd like to thank you very much for your kind introduction.
He views Africa as a continent faced by all forms of injustices from developed economies. He debates that the delegates at the summit should appropriately deliberate on the issues he raised and right the wrongs.
Africa is suffering from 3 areas of injustice: vaccine injustice, climate change injustice, energy transition injustice. On vaccine injustice, of the 600 million COVID-19 doses to be delivered by COVAX, only 71 million have been delivered and 48 million administered. Developed countries bought up most of the vaccines. Indeed, 20% of the world's population bought up over 80% of the vaccines in the world. Vaccine nationalism further blocked access. Global supply chains maxed out their capacities. So today, just 2% of Africa's population have been fully vaccinated, compared to 54% of adult population in the United States of America and 75% in Europe. On climate change injustice, Africa contributes less than 4% of the greenhouse gas emissions globally, but suffers disproportionately from its consequences, with increasing droughts and floods, destroying already low infrastructure levels, and causing $7 to $15 billion in annual losses, which could rise to $50 billion a year by 2040. Yet, Africa receives only a meager 3% of global climate financing. On energy transition injustice, the discussion now is about Africa getting out of gas. Africa is being treated just like developed countries, where the energy sector is the main source of 80% of the emissions. In Africa, it is the opposite. Emissions come from lack of energy, as a majority of our people depend on heavy fuel oil and fuel wood and kerosene as energy sources. While the rest of the world is transitioning from energy sources that give them 100% energy supplies, Africa is at ground zero and just developing its energy sources. While Africa, of course, will maximally use its renewable energy sources, there are limits. We must ensure access, affordability, and security or stability of energy. If Africa uses all its gas for electricity, it will have contributed just 0.67% to global emission. Africa should not be penalized. To deny Africa the use of gas, which is far more environmentally less polluting than charcoal, kerosene, and heavy fuel oil, is to kill African economies and its industrialization. Africa cannot be poor in an environmentally sustainable manner. Developed countries should meet their promise of $100 billion a year to developing countries to help them address climate change. So let fairness run in the corridors of decision makers and justice on the ashes of inequality. From vaccine access to greater financing to support climate adaptation and the use of gas combined with renewable energy sources, let justice reign. Let us ensure that we judge rightly, rule rightly, and ensure fairness for all in all your deliberations. Let there be equity, fairness, and justice for all. Let the voices of the less powerful be amplified. Honorable Mr. and Madam Speakers, I know that you will rule justly and fairly for the people, planet, and prosperity.
Speaking on the core mandate of the African Development Bank as spurring sustainable economic development and social progress in its regional member countries, while contributing to poverty reduction, it states that there is need to address impediments in economic growth in the era of COVID-19.
The African Development Bank is doing its part to support the rebooting of Africa's economic growth and to reduce some of these inequalities. The bank launched a $10 billion crisis response facility to provide financing to countries to address rising fiscal challenges at the start of the COVID-19 pandemic. The bank also launched a $3 billion Fight COVID-19 social bond on the global capital markets, the largest ever US dollar-denominated social bond in world history. Africa should not and must not outsource the health security of its 1.3 billion people to the benevolence of the world.
The African Development Bank boss highlights the pains of African manufacturers in the face of financial challenges. He adds that this and other issues relating to climate change and the development of initiatives that will promote great green wealth will be introduced in Africa.
Africa should not have to beg for vaccines. Africa should be manufacturing vaccines. The African Development Bank will provide $3 billion in financing to support Africa's pharmaceutical industries to ensure that the continent produces at least 70% of its medicines, up from currently 30%. We will also support the manufacturing of vaccines in Africa while building pharmaceutical and biomedical scientific capacities to produce vaccines for COVID-19 and future pandemics. The African Development Bank Group is taking bold actions to tackle climate change. We have been at the forefront on renewable energy. Think of the following, Your Excellencies. The African Development Bank and other development partners financed the 800 megawatts Middle Solar Project and the 510 megawatts New Wazazata, the world's largest concentrated solar facility. This will help Morocco to achieve its goal of 52% renewable energy mix by 2030. The bank is currently implementing a new bold initiative called Desert to Power to develop 10,000 megawatts of solar power in the Sahel region of Africa, which will provide electricity to 250 million people. It will be the largest solar zone in the world. In addition, the bank is supporting the United Nations efforts on the Great Green Wall, an environmental defense shield against desertification in the Sahel and the Sahara. The bank has committed to invest $6.5 billion in this program to boost the climate lungs of Africa. The bank is leading on climate adaptation financing for Africa. Last year, the African Development Bank invested 63% of its climate finance in adaptation, making us the first multilateral development bank globally to achieve and surpass the 50-50 parity for climate mitigation and adaptation called for by the United Nations. In his opening address at the United Nations General Assembly last month, Secretary General Antonio Guterres recognized the African Development Bank as an example for other development partners by allocating at least half of its climate finance to adaptation.
Inclusive growth, particularly amongst women and youth vis-a-vis job creation for the youth, it says is crucial to the economic development of Africa.
The Africa Continental Free Trade Area presents a huge opportunity for economic growth, but its success will depend on massive investments in infrastructure. Over the past 2 decades, the African Development Bank has provided over $40 billion in support of infrastructure on the continent. This places the bank far ahead of any other global or regional financing institution. To ensure inclusive growth, the African Development Bank is focusing on women and youth. The bank's Affirmative Finance Action for Women in Africa, which we call AFAWA, is helping to leverage $3 billion for women-owned businesses in Africa. Our Jobs for Youth program in Africa has the goal of creating 25 million jobs and improving the skills of 50 million youth. The future of Africa's youth does not lie in Europe or anywhere else, but in a prosperous Africa, delivering quality and inclusive growth for its large youthful population. Your Excellencies, with regard to debt, Africa needs your support. I wish to commend the G20 for its leadership on the Debt Service Suspension Initiative, as well as the G20 Common Framework to address private and commercial debt of the continent, which now accounts for 40% of external debt. The decision of the IMF to issue $650 billion in special drawing rights, SDRs, will go a long way towards macroeconomic stabilization while boosting balance of payment reserves. However, the $33 billion issued to Africa is too small and falls way below the minimum of $100 billion called for by African heads of state. I would therefore like to urge G20 countries to fully commit to the proposal that has been spearheaded by France and the United States to reallocate an additional $100 billion of SDRs to developing countries. That part of the $650 billion special drawing rights issued by the International Monetary Fund should also be allocated to multilateral development banks, such as the African Development Bank, specifically for Africa. The African Development Bank can leverage these SDRs 3 to 4 times and provide much-needed financing for development finance institutions all across Africa. These will complement the macroeconomic stabilization drive of the International Monetary Fund with its Poverty and Growth Trust and its Resilience and Sustainability Trust. It will unleash the complementary power of the global financial architecture, the IMF and the multilateral development banks. It will also allow the African Development Fund, which supports low-income and fragile states, to have additional concessional resources as we look toward a more robust 16 replenishment of the fund next year. In addition, the bank is supporting the United Nations efforts on the Great Green Wall, an environmental defense shield against desertification in the Sahel and the Sahara. The bank has committed to invest $6.5 billion in this program to boost the climate lungs of Africa. The bank is leading on climate adaptation financing for Africa. Last year, the African Development Bank invested 63% of its climate finance in adaptation, making us the first multilateral development bank globally to achieve and surpass the 50-50 parity for climate mitigation and adaptation called for by the United Nations. In his opening address at the United Nations General Assembly last month, Secretary General Antonio Guterres recognized the African Development Bank as an example for other development partners by allocating at least half of its climate finance to adaptation. The bank and the Global Center on Adaptation have launched the African Adaptation Acceleration Program, otherwise called AAAP, to mobilize $25 billion for climate adaptation for Africa. Your Excellencies, the bank's work on agriculture has already benefited 71 million people in the past 5 years, including millions with access to drought-tolerant crops to build resilience, food and nutritional security.
In conclusion, Dr. Adesina adds that there is a huge divide between the rural communities and urban cities of Africa, and he highlights the need for the delegates to support global digitalization through financial inclusion.
The divide between the rural and the urban area. I think that one is very, very critical because most of those that will suffer the consequences of climate change in our world today are those in the rural areas, and they are least able to actually support that. So I think that's very, very important for us to do. The second is that we need to also support greater digitalization, and I really like those points that were made because we need to make sure that we have a lot more financial inclusion. Because if you have financial inclusion, people have more resources to also be able to adapt to the changes that we see all around us. And finally is the issue of how we help developing countries, in particular, to deal with exogenous climatic shocks. We have something at the African Development Bank that is called it's a facility anyway, to help countries to insure themselves against exogenous climatic shocks. It's very, very important to be able to pay for premiums for that. So the least developed countries, the small island states, don't have the resources to adapt. And that facility for us is about $250 million. We need to be able to use that facility to support countries so they can get payouts of maybe about $1 billion. It's going to be very, very important for them. And finally is the role that you all play as honorable speakers in terms of legislations. I think for me, I feel very encouraged today, honorable speaker, that I'm here to see the leaders of our parliament actually giving voice to the issue of climate, the issue of inclusion, and the issue of social participation in the process. So I want to really thank you very much. All I want to do is just to thank you for really inviting me to be here, and thank you for your leadership as we build a world that is more prosperous and a world that we can live a better future for all of our children and grandchildren.
After other world's big economies conclude with their submissions, the 7th G20 Parliamentary Speakers Conference then came to a close, with pronouncement that the representatives will meet at the 8th P20 Summit in Indonesia with the theme, Recovery Today, Recover Stronger to address the global challenges.
The expectation is that after such a compelling presentation by Dr. Adesina, the Parliament of the People, Planet and Prosperity, as the P20 is often referred to, will expand its partnership portfolio with Africa. And that's it on this episode of the program. Thanks for your time. And of course, your usual company. I'm Jeffrey Uzongo.